November 13, 2007. The air in Speak, Liverpool was thick with the kind of damp chill that seeps right into the bone. At a local gym, a 59-year-old man was wrapping up his routine. To the casual observer, he was just another middle-aged fitness enthusiast fighting the onset of age, a father of 4, unassuming, dressed in generic workout gear. But Colin Smith was no ordinary father. For 6 years, he had been walking through life with a target painted on his back, a ghost haunting his own existence. As he dried off and grabbed his keys, his phone buzzed. A single text message. It was not a threat. Nor was it spam. It was a summons, crafted to look like an urgent business matter, requiring his presence outside. He checked the screen, pocketed the device, and walked toward the exit doors. He did not know it yet, but he had just read his own death warrant. Stepping out into the darkness, Smith scanned the car park. The mundane sounds of a Tuesday evening, distant traffic, the hum of streetlights masked the approach of a predator. He was looking for a contact. Instead, he found a shadow. The assassin did not hesitate. Armed with a pump-action shotgun, a weapon chosen, not for subtlety, but for absolute, catastrophic certainty, the killer closed the distance. There were no words exchanged, no dramatic speeches, just the deafening roar of 2 shots fired at close range. In seconds, Colin Smith, a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of international drug trafficking for decades, was reduced to a memory on the cold pavement. The hit was clinical, brutal, and terrifyingly professional. It bore all the hallmarks of a contract that had been signed in blood, thousands of miles away. This execution was not a random act of street violence. It was the closing of an account that had been open for 6 long years. It poses a terrifying question. What would you do if a single decision destroyed everything you had built? If one moment of greed transformed your quiet, comfortable life into a nightmare that crossed oceans and placed £1 million bounty on your head? To his neighbors, Smith was a car wash owner who kept his head down. He lived modestly, drove unremarkable cars, and played the part of the devoted family man to perfection. But behind this carefully constructed facade of suburban mediocrity lay one of Britain's most sophisticated criminal minds. Smith was the architect of a cocaine empire that rivaled legitimate logistics companies in its efficiency. He had direct pipeline connections to the Colombian Cartels, organizations that control billions in the global trade and view human life as a simple line item on a balance sheet. For 15 years, Smith survived by adhering to 2 golden rules: stay invisible and always pay your debts. These principles made him rich, they made him trusted, and they kept him breathing. But in 2001 he deviated. He made a choice that would haunt him until that final walk out of the gym. He decided to steal from men who never forgive, never forget, and always collect. Today, we are unraveling the story of Liverpool's quiet Kingpin. We will dissect a £20 million betrayal and the brutal mathematics of cartel justice. This is not just a crime story, it is a lesson in how thin the line truly is between survival and destruction. If you are fascinated by the hidden worlds operating right under our noses, hit that subscribe button. Because today's story explains how Colin Smith learned that some debts can only be settled in blood. To fully grasp how a man like Colin Smith became a marked target for the world's most dangerous organizations, we must rewind the clock to the environment that forged him. We need to look at Liverpool in the 1980s, a city that felt like it had been forgotten by the rest of the United Kingdom. Once the proud gateway to the British Empire, the city was hemorrhaging life. The docks that had generated wealth for generations were shuttering, and the silence of the cranes was deafening. Unemployment in some areas skyrocketed to 40%. Entire neighborhoods were crumbling, abandoned by investment and hope. Young men who, in a different era, would have been apprentices or dock workers, found themselves standing on rain-slicked street corners with empty pockets and idle hands. Into this vacuum of desperation poured a substance that would irrevocably alter the city's DNA: drugs. First came the heroin, flooding the estates and earning Liverpool the grim moniker of Smack City in the press. But heroin was messy. It was a desperate drug for desperate people. The real architects of the underworld knew that cocaine was where the true fortune lay. South American cartels, controlling 80% of the global supply, looked at Liverpool not as a dying city, but as a perfect logistical hub. It was a port city, with a population of hungry, hardened young men, who had zero faith in the legitimate system. For them, the choice was stark and binary: stay poor on the dole queue, or get involved. There were no university dreams here, only the hustle. Out of this chaotic cauldron rose the first generation of cocky watchmen, and chief among them was Curtis Warren. By the early 1990s, Warren had become the gold standard for British drug barons. He was not just rich, he was astronomically wealthy, making the Sunday Times rich list, with an estimated fortune of £12 million, a figure that would be closer to £500 million in today's money. Warren was the prototype. He owned properties across Europe, drove flash cars, and commanded respect through sheer force of personality. He proved that if you were ruthless enough, the drug trade was not just a side hustle, it was a path to becoming a tycoon. However, Curtis Warren also proved something else: visibility is a death sentence. His success was too loud. He became a trophy for law enforcement. In 1996, Dutch police, who had been monitoring his every move, seized a massive shipment and dismantled his network. Warren was thrown into a cell, his empire collapsing overnight. Suddenly, there was a power vacuum at the pinnacle of the Liverpool underworld. While lesser criminals fought openly in the streets for Warren's crown, triggering petty turf wars, Colin Smith was watching. He was analyzing. Smith realized that Warren's fatal flaw was not his business acumen, it was his ego. Warren wanted to be the king. Smith just wanted the kingdom. While others mimicked Warren's flashiness, Smith constructed something entirely different, something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. He adopted the persona of the grey man. On the surface, Colin Smigger Smith was the antithesis of a drug lord. He did not wear Versace. He wore tracksuits. He did not drive Ferraris. He drove practical sedans. He lived in an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, seemingly content with a mundane existence. His neighbors saw a devoted father who worked long hours at his car wash businesses to provide for his 4 children. They saw a man who mowed his lawn and kept to himself. But this mediocrity was a calculated mirage. It was the most sophisticated criminal disguise in Britain. Smith understood that if you look like everyone else, no one looks at you twice. While the police were busy chasing the loudmouths and the tough guys, Smith was quietly stepping into the void left by Warren, ready to build an empire that prioritized silence over fame and logistics over ego. Behind the closed doors of his nondescript office, Colin Smith was not just running a car wash. He was the CEO of a multinational logistics corporation that just happened to deal in illegal commodities. While his competitors were busy shooting each other in pub car parks for control of a few street corners, Smith was orchestrating the movement of metric tons of cocaine with a level of sophistication that baffled law enforcement. He treated drug trafficking not as a criminal hustle, but as a supply chain management challenge. The genius of Smith's operation lay in its complexity and its camouflage. His product did not arrive in risky suitcases carried by nervous mules. It came hidden deep within the bowels of massive cargo ships docking in Liverpool, buried inside legitimate freight that customs officers could not possibly search in its entirety. He utilized fleets of specially modified vehicles, engineered with hydraulic compartments, so seamless that even a trained mechanic might miss them. These cars crossed back and forth from mainland Europe, ferrying cash and product across borders as easily as tourists on holiday. Furthermore, he tapped into the network of British expatriates living in Spain, the infamous Costa del Crime, using them as a reliable distribution web that kept the heat off his operations back home on Merseyside. Every step of this process was planned with military precision and executed with corporate efficiency. But Smith's greatest asset was not his smuggling tech. It was his reputation. In the shadowy world of international narcotics, trust is a currency far more valuable than the euro or the pound. Suppliers need to know they will be paid. Distributors need to know the product will arrive. Most importantly, everyone needs to know that the operation won't be blown by loose lips or reckless behavior. Colin Smith built his brand on 2 pillars: discretion and reliability. He was the anti-gangster. He never missed a payment. He never bragged about his conquests in nightclubs. He never got involved in the petty, violent feuds that acted as magnets for police attention. He was the businessman's criminal professional. Dependable and utterly boring. This reputation opened doors that violence never could. The Colombian Cartels, organizations that are naturally paranoid and deeply suspicious of outsiders, began to view Smith as a unicorn, a foreign partner they could actually work with long term. They saw a man who respected the product and the business, a man who understood that their cocaine was worth more than gold and treated it with the appropriate reverence. By the late 1990s, this approach had elevated Smith to a stratosphere that Curtis Warren had only touched briefly. He was handling shipments worth tens of millions of pounds. His network stretched from the coca fields of South America, through the ports of Europe, and into the veins of Britain. Yet, to the outside world, he remained invisible. Former associates would later describe him as the one you would never suspect. He could walk into a room full of police officers, and they would see nothing more than a tired, middle-aged businessman, perhaps worried about his taxes or his cholesterol, certainly not Britain's most prolific drug importer. He mastered the art of compartmentalization. His family life and his criminal empire existed in parallel universes that never touched. He would attend parent-teacher evenings at his children's schools, chatting amiably with other fathers about football and tuition fees, while simultaneously coordinating the arrival of a shipment that could supply the entire north of England for a month. For over a decade, this system was flawless. He grew wealthy while staying invisible. He provided for his family while avoiding the bloodshed that decimated his rivals. It was the perfect criminal life, successful, sustainable, and safe. But as Smith would soon learn, perfection in the underworld is a fragile thing. And even the most careful architect can't build a structure that withstands the chaos of human greed forever. Every great empire, whether legitimate or criminal, requires a balance of forces. For Colin Smith, the quiet strategist, the missing variable was brute force. He found his counterbalance in Steven Lawler. If Smith was the ice-cool, calculated and invisible, Lawler was the fire that burned bright and dangerous. They were opposites in every conceivable way. Yet their partnership was the engine that drove their operation to its peak. Lawler was everything Smith refused to be. While Smith was blending into the wallpaper, Lawler was kicking down the door. A former nightclub bouncer, Lawler was a man of imposing physical presence who thrived on confrontation. He did not just handle violence, he seemed to enjoy the theater of it. He drove the flashy cars Smith avoided, wore the designer clothes Smith shunned, and made sure everyone in the club knew exactly who he was. He was the face of the operation, the lightning rod that drew attention away from the quiet man counting the money in the back room. For years, this symbiosis was perfect. Smith needed someone to handle the dirty work, the debt collection, the enforcement, the terrifying negotiations, where a spreadsheet was not enough to get the point across. Lawler, in turn, needed someone with the intellect to turn his brute force into sustainable wealth. Smith provided the structure. Lawler provided the muscle. But Lawler became more than just a bodyguard. Crucially, he became the primary interface with the Colombian Cartels. The Colombians, operating in a world of extreme violence, respected Lawler's aggression. To them, his volatility read as strength. They saw him as a man of action, someone who could ensure their product was respected and their money was secure. By 2001, Lawler was not just breaking legs, he was brokering deals worth tens of millions. He had evolved from a street tough into a high-level operator, his reach extending from the docks of Liverpool to the stash houses of Amsterdam and the jungles of Bogota. But fire is hard to contain, and Lawler's visibility came with a price. Liverpool was in the grip of the infamous Door Wars, a violent, chaotic feud between rival firms fighting for control of nightclub security contracts. In the drug trade, controlling the doors meant controlling the marketplace inside. Lawler, with his bouncer background and high profile, was right in the center of the crosshairs. He was a combatant in a war that Smith had studiously tried to ignore. In May 2001, the inevitable happened. Steven Lawler was gunned down in broad daylight, his body left in the street as a gruesome message to his faction. The murder was a turning point in Liverpool's underworld history, but for Colin Smith, it was a catastrophe. Lawler's death did not just mean the loss of a friend or a trusted lieutenant. It meant the loss of his firewall, the buffer between the quiet accountant and the violent suppliers was gone. Even worse, Lawler died, holding the keys to the kingdom. He was the only other person who knew the intimate details of a massive, pending deal, a shipment that was supposed to be the retirement fund for both men. With Lawler in the morgue, Smith was suddenly exposed, standing alone in the spotlight he had avoided for 15 years, facing a Colombian connection that was expecting results. Not excuses. The shield was gone, and the clock was ticking. With Steven Lawler cold in the ground, Colin Smith stood at the precipice of the most dangerous decision of his life. The partnership was broken, but the machinery of their empire was still running. Specifically, there was a ghost in the machine, a massive shipment that Lawler had arranged just before his murder. We are talking about 500 kilograms of high-grade Colombian cocaine. In the economics of the underworld, this was not just a shipment, it was a retirement plan. On the streets of Britain, cut and distributed, that powder was worth £72 million. The drugs were sitting in a secure warehouse in the Netherlands, waiting. The Colombians expected their money. The downstream distributors expected their product. But the linchpin, Lawler, was dead. This created a vacuum of information that Smith realized he could exploit. He was the only one left with the access codes, the location, and the logistics to move it. Smith faced a binary choice, starker than any he had faced before. Option A, do the honorable thing in criminal terms. Contact the cartel, explain Lawler's death, facilitate the sale, take his standard cut, and maintain the trust that had kept him alive for 15 years. Option B, take it all. For a man who had built his entire identity on caution and low-risk steady gains, Smith's next move was bafflingly reckless. Perhaps the sheer scale of the money blinded him. £72 million is generational wealth. It is power. It is freedom. Smith chose option B. He decided to steal the shipment, sell it himself, and pocket every single penny. But you cannot simply steal half a ton of cocaine from a cartel and ghost them. They would hunt you to the ends of the earth. Smith needed a cover story. A lie so plausible that even the most suspicious narco-trafficker would accept it as bad luck. He crafted the Dutch defense. He contacted his suppliers and delivered the bad news with feigned devastation. The shipment had been seized by Dutch customs. It was the perfect lie because it was boringly common. In the high-stakes game of international trafficking, seizures are just the cost of doing business. The cartels, usually pragmatic about such losses, wrote it off as a tax on the trade. For months the gamble paid off. Smith quietly moved the product through his own secure channels. The car washes, the expatriate networks in Spain. For modified trucks. He was washing the money and stacking the cash, believing he had pulled off the crime of the century. He had robbed the devil and walked away unscathed. But in the criminal underworld, there are no secrets, only delayed truths. The weak link in Smith's master plan was a man known to associates as Stephen the Blonde French. This associate knew the truth about the shipment. He knew there had been no police raid, no Dutch customs seizure. Whether it was motivated by a grudge, a desire for a reward, or simply the currency of information, the Blonde French made a call to South America. He sold Smith out. When the news reached the cartel bosses in Colombia, the reaction was not one of anger, but of cold calculation. This was not just about the money. To them, losing money is a business annoyance. Being lied to is an insult to their honor. But Smith had played them for fools. He had taken their product, sold it, and laughed all the way to the bank while they mourned a loss that never happened. The realization shifted the tectonic plates of Smith's world instantly. He went from a valued partner to a dead man walking. The order was given, the budget was set, and the hunt began. When the Colombian cartels issue a death warrant, it does not come on official letterhead. It comes as a whisper that echoes through every prison, nightclub, and stash house on the continent. The price on Colin Smith's head was set at £1 million. In the criminal underworld, a sum that large transforms the environment around you. It turns friends into potential Judas figures and strangers into prospective assassins. For 6 agonizing years, Smith lived in a suffocating twilight zone, suspended between the ordinary life he projected and the violent death that was stalking him. Most men in Smith's position would have vanished. They would have grabbed a fake passport, liquidated their assets, and disappeared into a beach town in Thailand or Brazil. But Smith was a prisoner of his own success and his own hubris. He calculated that running would be an admission of guilt that he could never retract. To run was to lose everything he had built. So he chose a strategy that was as audacious as it was terrifying. He decided to hide in plain sight. He bet his life on the hope that if he acted normal enough, for long enough, the heat would eventually die down. Between 2003 and 2007, Smith aggressively pivoted toward legitimacy. He tried to wash his hands of the dirt that had made him rich. The car washes, once convenient fronts for laundering drug money, became his primary focus. He poured energy into making them genuine, profitable enterprises. He invested heavily in Spanish real estate, purchasing clean assets that could not be seized. To his wife and children, this looked like a father finally slowing down, prioritizing family dinners over late-night business meetings. They saw a man finding peace. In reality, they were watching a man building a bunker. But the peace was an illusion. Intelligence reports from the time suggest that Smith survived at least 2 professional hit attempts during this period. These were not dramatic shootouts. They were silent failures. A schedule changed at the last minute. A car parked in a different spot. Smith survived these brushes with death, not through skill, but through sheer dumb luck. The psychological toll of this existence is hard to imagine. Every time a car trailed him for too long, every time a phone rang late at night, every time a stranger made eye contact on the street, the adrenaline would spike. He was living with the sword of Damocles, hanging by a thread over his head, yet he had to smile and discuss school grades with his children. The fatal error in Smith's calculus was a misunderstanding of his enemy. He was used to dealing with British gangsters, men who are impulsive, hot-headed, and whose feuds often burn out when the next drama comes along. But the cartels operate on a different timeline. They function less like street gangs and more like corporations with a very strict HR policy regarding theft. They are patient, they are institutional. To them, 6 years is nothing. In fact, the delay serves a purpose. It lets the target relax. It lets them drop their guard. By late 2007, the silence from South America had become deafening. Smith likely began to believe the impossible, that he had gotten away with it. He thought perhaps the cartels had written off the debt, or that the leadership changes in Colombia meant his transgression had been forgotten in the shuffle. He started to slip back into a true routine, letting the paranoia fade, allowing himself to believe in the future again. He did not realize that the silence was not peace. It was the quiet of a predator holding its breath before the strike. The cartels had not forgotten. They were just waiting for the perfect Tuesday. When the shotgun blast shattered the quiet of that November evening, it did more than end the life of Colin Smith. It sent a shockwave through the British underworld that is still felt today. As the police tape went up around the gym and the blue lights reflected off the wet pavement, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This was not a warning. It was not a botched robbery. It was a receipt. The cartel had finally collected its debt. Merseyside police immediately launched Operation Nike, one of the most intensive murder investigations in the city's history. On paper, the detectives had everything they needed. They knew the victim's history, they knew about the missing £72 million shipment, and they knew about the bounty. The motive was as clear as day. A textbook contract killing, ordered by South American suppliers. Yet knowing the truth, and proving it in a court of law, are two very different things. The investigation hit a brick wall constructed of fear and professional distance. The hitman was a ghost, likely flown in specifically for the job, and flown out before the body was even cold. The local criminals, usually prone to gossiping, were struck dumb. In Liverpool you might talk about a local feud, but you do not talk about the Colombians. That is a level of heat that burns down entire neighborhoods. Despite dozens of arrests and years of inquiries, Operation Nike never resulted in a conviction for the murder. The case remains officially unsolved, a testament to the effectiveness of international organized crime. Colin Smith's story is a brutal lesson in the mathematics of the drug trade. He was a man who believed he could solve any equation. He thought that if he balanced the books, stayed quiet, and laundered his money, he could cheat the system. But he forgot the fundamental variable. the human element. He stole from men who view violence not as a last resort, but as a standard operating procedure. In the end, the £20 million Smith profited from that stolen shipment became meaningless numbers on a screen. You cannot spend millions when you are dead. His grey man persona, the decades of careful planning, the legitimate businesses, the family holidays, it was all dismantled in a fraction of a second because of one decision to get greedy. Smith's legacy serves as a grim warning to anyone seduced by the allure of the easy money lifestyle. It reminds us that there is no such thing as a retired drug lord. There are only those who are lucky and those who are caught. Colin Smith thought he was the exception to the rule. He thought he could outsmart the game. But the house always wins, and in this game the price of losing is everything. The quiet family man died alone on the concrete, surrounded by the ordinary life he tried so hard to mimic, but could never truly own.